The 10 years that separated the Yalta Conference of 1945 from the formation of the two opposed military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, completed by 1955, saw a decline in the relationship between the two superpowers and the start of the Cold War. Each event can be shown as having contributed to that decline. At the same time, you, as a historian, need to be able to recognize how large a single event's contribution was and which side was responsible for that contribution. Whilst Yalta is regarded as the first of these events, it was itself the second conference between the leaders of the Big Three, Britain, America and Russia. They had a good working relationship. Of special note was President Roosevelt's trust in Stalin to keep his word. With the end of the war in sight, the Big Three were concerned with how Europe and the world would be run after Nazi Germany's defeat. All three countries had different views on this, and it is at this conference where the beginning of these differences were felt. However, it must be stressed that overall relations remained good. The key terms agreed at Yalta were the temporary division of Germany into 4 zones of occupation, that the USSR would join the conflict in the east by declaring war on Japan, that an international organization, the United Nations, would be set up to maintain the peace, and most crucially, that the newly liberated or freed countries in Eastern Europe that had been overrun by Nazi forces in World War II and were now occupied by the Soviet Red Army would receive free democratic elections to choose their own governments. The next key milestone in the decline in friendship between the superpowers was the final wartime conference held in July to August 1945 at Potsdam, a small town close to the German capital. By this conference, a number of key events had changed the relationship between the two powers. Whilst they still are all smiles for the cameras, behind the scenes tensions were rising. Firstly, by Potsdam, Germany had surrendered, meaning there was no mutual enemy to unite the two countries. Secondly, the close working relationship between Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill had been broken down due to the replacement of leaders of the two Western powers. Roosevelt had died in April 1945 and been replaced by his inexperienced and more anti-Soviet deputy, Truman. Churchill lost a general election during the conference and was replaced by Labour leader Attlee. Thirdly, closely linked with Truman's more abrasive attitude to negotiations with Stalin, was the successful American testing of a new deadly weapon, the atomic bomb, which would shortly be used to smash Japan into surrender, and Truman believed gave America the advantage in all negotiations. Thus it can be seen that distrust was growing between the erstwhile allies. From the Russian perspective, the Americans were becoming overly aggressive, especially as they now had their own superweapon. Stalin, an already extremely paranoid man, wanted safeguards from what he suspected might be a future invasion by Western powers. He had reason to be suspicious of the West. In the past 30 years, Russia had been invaded 3 times by Western countries. Once by Germany in 1914, once by America, Britain and France in 1919, and again by Germany in 1941. To guarantee some sort of safety net, or buffer zone, from possible future invasions, therefore, Stalin was keen to make sure the countries of Eastern Europe, such as Poland, that had all been recently liberated from Nazi invaders by the Soviet Red Army, be led by governments who supported Russia. Stalin fixed or rigged elections to make certain the outcome gave power to local communist parties. This caused tension between the USSR and the Western powers. America and Britain saw this as a violation of the agreement made at Yalta, guaranteeing free elections. Britain in particular had gone to war in 1939 to protect Poland. A government in exile had been based in London. Many Poles had reason to hate the Soviets. The USSR had actually invaded Poland simultaneously with Nazi Germany in 1939. They had murdered over 22,000 Polish officers in what became known as the Katyn massacre of 1940, that the retreating Nazis had revealed to the world in 1943. In addition, in August 1944, an uprising in the Polish capital city of Warsaw by resistance fighters that had been timed to defeat the Nazis as the Soviet Red Army neared was brutally suppressed by the Nazi forces. the Red Army waited close by with no intention of helping. 300,000 Poles were killed. Potsdam saw agreement between the Allies over reparations, repayments for the cost of the war, for Germany, the details of the German-Polish borders, and the denazification of Germany. But it saw disagreements over the occupation of Japan, control of the Ruhr, and most importantly, what happened in Eastern Europe. It is important to understand that the different sides had different perspectives on events. The West saw Stalin's growth of influence in Eastern Europe as aggressive and denying those people democratic representation. From the USSR's point of view, in a democratic election, the only party to be chosen is the Communist Party. All other parties upheld undemocratic, capitalist repression. Therefore, Stalin was fulfilling his promise to hold democratic elections, and at the same time ensuring that there was a buffer zone, or region of friendly countries between Russia and the West, that could slow any possible future invasion from that direction. The new hostility towards the Soviet Union was encouraged by Winston Churchill in a famous speech made on the 5th of March 1946. Having lost the general election in the UK, Churchill was no longer constrained by public office to be diplomatic about his opinions on the USSR. He made a tour of the United States, where he was extremely popular for his unceasing efforts in World War II. In the speech, Churchill called for an American-British alliance to meet the communist menace. The most memorable line from the speech was, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." This, of course, was a metaphor. There was no actual iron curtain. He meant it figuratively. What Churchill was implying was that there was a divider, the curtain, of immutable strength, hence being made of iron, that was separating the free, democratic and capitalist countries of the West from the oppressed authoritarian and communist countries of the East. Not only can this be viewed as another milestone in the deterioration of the relationship between the East and the West, it can also quite fairly be assessed as being the fault of the West. Stalin was quite understandably offended by his former allies' comments, whom he had had a close working relationship with during the war. Stalin viewed it as particularly ironic, since it came from a man who was keen to preserve the British Empire, a regime that had subjugated millions of people against their will for over 100 years. Now please remember, the Iron Curtain speech happened in 1946, and is a separate milestone from the Berlin blockade of 1948, or the creation of the Berlin Wall, which was not part of this topic and did not occur until 1961. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, as discussed previously, was an attempt by Stalin to ensure that there was a buffer zone of friendly nations, or satellite states, between Russia and the West. These would slow down any possible future invasion that would necessarily have to come through those countries first to get to Russia. The key terms to understand here are buffer zone, satellite state, and rigged elections. With buffer zone, think of the end of a train line. There is a contraption called a buffer there to cushion and in essence slow down a train if it does not stop in time. In a similar manner, Eastern Europe was to be used as a buffer zone to slow any invading force bent on destroying the USSR. Each country that comprised that buffer zone was run by a communist party that effectively took its orders from Moscow, the capital of Russia. Thus these countries were called satellite states, a reference to the idea that they were heavily influenced by Russia in the same way a satellite such as the Moon is heavily influenced in its orbit by the Earth. Rigged elections mean to fix an election result to ensure who you want to win does so. The continent was separating ever more clearly into two separate camps.